Housing International is the housing sector body. We'd like you to do a study as to how the Sustainable Development Goals have relevance within your sectors. And so Co-op Housing International undertook a 2-year study into the housing sector's applicability and relevance relating to the SDGs. And the study focused on 11 of the 17 SDGs that were specifically of relevance to the housing sector. These are indicators, these are SDGs where members play an important role in relieving poverty, in relieving inequality and insecurity around tenure, for example. And also the project created a series or suggested a series of targets and indicators that related to the SDGs that were of relevance to housing organisations. And therefore, bringing that sort of day-to-day relevance of the SDGs into the nuts and bolts of how individual housing co-ops operate on the ground. So further to that, in the UK, CCH as the UK's sector representative and essentially an active member organisation in the ICA and Co-op Housing International, saw this as part of a continuance. Okay, well, what are we going to do in the UK to respond to this agenda and lead on it? And so we created our climate change and sustainability advice service and aligned that with our broader services offer for our member organisations. And we began that work 2 years ago, led by one of our associates, James Neward. And then recently, that has led on to us doing development work that builds on our Wayshaper Options Toolkit, which we've spoken about previously, and creates elements now that specifically address sustainability. There will be 3 elements to the Wayshaper SDG Toolkit. What we're talking about today is the first element that we've published, the Sustainable Homes element, and Jim will speak in more detail once I hand on to him relating to the breadth of the project. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to introduce these specific areas of the SDGs that were deemed relevant and specific to housing. So SDG 4, which focuses on quality education, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities. Well, education is one of the 7 cooperative values and principles. It should be central to what we all do in cooperatives. And so how does that translate to a housing sector specific issue? Well, it's about what are we doing as organisations to ensure that our members are able to learn about the cooperative movement, its history, its values, its principles, but also, how do we create opportunities and access for our members, for our residents, to access education programs, vocational training, and personal development? Next up, looks at gender equality. So how do organisations achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls? So how is that relevant in housing? Well, what are we doing in our organisations to reduce violence against women, against girls, against LGBTQ plus residents? How are we promoting that culture of gender equality? How are we ensuring that our procedures, our processes, our structures are enabling women to move into leadership and management roles in our organisations? How are we recognising the value of unpaid voluntary work, which is so important to many cooperatives? Is there a general acceptance within organisations of the value of gender equality? And is there equitable rights to land and control over land within our organisations across genders? Moving on. And the first of the SDGs that falls within the category of what we're going to be talking about today, which is the Sustainable Homes Toolkit. Those first 2, SDG 4 and SDG 5, will be more central subject in the forthcoming Sustainable Organisations Toolkit that we'll produce. But the SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. So how do we ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy in our organisations? So a sort of starting point on that is, do we have reliable access to electricity in our homes? What are we doing to reduce our reliance on increase our reliance on clean fuels and technology relative to total energy consumption? And what are we doing to increase energy efficiency? And a lot of the Sustainable Homes Toolkit is focused on, amongst other things, increasing energy efficiency and moving away from an over-reliance on old, dirty energy technologies. Moving on, SDG 8. And this, again, will be one of the ones that we come to in the subsequent toolkits, but this is looking at decent work and economic growth within organisations. So what do we do to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth in our organisations? How do we create meaningful, full and productive employment and decent work opportunities for people? So firstly, from a housing perspective, how does that translate into what are we doing to encourage economic growth in the least developed countries? But also, what are we doing to increase the levels of paid employment and recognition for the importance of being good payers within our organisations, regardless of which parts of the globe that they're within? Moving on. Reduce inequalities. So what are we doing to reduce inequality generally across our organisations and within our countries? So again, how are we as organisations increasing awareness of the importance of inclusionary practices and the link that there is between the cooperative values of equity and equality, and how that is translated into real meaningful policy and action within our organisations? Moving along. Number 11, very much a central focus of the Sustainable Homes Toolkit, is SDG 11, focusing on sustainable cities and communities. So how do we make our cities, our settlements, our homes inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable? And two key areas where the housing project focused on here is what are we doing to provide adequate, safe and affordable housing? How do we provide services and protection against extreme weather events taking place? And you know, we all have our stories of increasing levels of extreme weather events in recent years. And also, what are we doing to increase the use of sustainable design technologies and low emission construction practices, both in new build but also in refurbishment works? Moving on. Number 12, again, elements of this touch on the Sustainable Homes Toolkit, but elements will also touch on the Sustainable Living Toolkit, which will look at waste and usage. But number 12 focuses on ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. So what are we doing to reduce our overall carbon footprint within our cooperatives by committing to energy efficiency and waste management and anti-contamination practices? Moving on. 13 is the sort of broad SDG about climate action. So what are we doing to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts? And in a housing setting, you know, what are we doing to improve our preparedness within our housing stock and the built environment that we manage and own for climate related and other natural disasters and hazards? Moving along, number 15, more broadly relates to how we interact with the land. And as organizations that are based around land and the built environment, what are we doing to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of territorial ecosystems? And specifically, how are we demonstrating responsible land stewardship within our development programs and within our management of homes? Moving on. Those are my contact details. If any of you wish to contact me further to talk about this broad topic or any other issues, please feel free to contact me on the details that are there. So I'm now going to introduce Jim Holt to you. Jim is the specialist designer who first pitched the initial Wayshaper Options Planning Toolkit concept to me at a training program that I was delivering a number of years ago, when he said, this all sounds really interesting, but a lot of that's in your head, isn't it? How do we get it out of your head into a usable manner that other people can easily access. And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And so I commissioned Jim to start working on an options planning toolkit during COVID, or just in the lead up to COVID. And that has led on to him working centrally in creating the sustainable homes element of our Wayshaper SDG package of resources. So I'm going to hand you over to Jim now.
Thanks, Blase.
Jim, you had your hand up. Did you have a question for Blase?
No. No, that was me clicking on the chat link, but not clicking on the chat link correctly.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks, Blase. I'm going to share a screen now when I find it. Why does this always take me by surprise when I can't share a screen? Here we go. Yes, so as Blase mentioned, we've been working on Wayshaper for some years now. We began in 2020, and the initial concept was really to simplify and accelerate the process for groups of people looking to set up a community-led housing project from scratch. We were kindly asked to deliver that in Zurich a couple of years ago, and it was warmly received, and we got a lot of interest internationally. But as with these things, international application of it would be based on international law and international kind of conditions, and similarly with Wayshaper Sustainable Homes. So this has been developed with the UK in mind. It works pretty much with any temperate isle or temperate place, but of course grant funding and things like that might be different in different places. But for now, we're looking at the UK. This is the team of us that have been working on it so far. The two people on the right, James and Maria, are the retrofit advisors. I come at this from the perspective of a designer and creative, and not from the point of a retrofit advisor. I've learned a lot about retrofit during this process, but during this presentation, we won't be giving specific advice or ideas about how to retrofit, more about the process by which you might go through. And as Blase mentioned, we've got 4 of the SDGs really kind of catered for within this, and others catered for within other elements of the Wayshaper suite, which we're developing, and I'll come to that at the end of the presentation. So the problem or opportunity, as I like to see these things, there's many stats that will be banding around, and you can see banded around, to do with the issue of housing and retrofit. But chief amongst those is the carbon emissions, and in the UK that's 17% of carbon emissions due to heating domestic buildings, and that's strangely equivalent to all the output of all the UK petrol and diesel cars. So that's quite a staggering amount when you think about it, and it makes me think about perhaps don't buy an electric car, retrofit home instead. There might be quicker ways of reducing our carbon emissions and give us other benefits in kind. Of course, energy prices have been rising, so reduction of energy consumption in a home would have its own benefits financially. So there's a sort of double side to this, and really a lot of the energy consumption, the majority of it is through heating and hot water. So turning light bulbs off and running your TV less might have some impact, but really the bulk of it is consumed by things that we need to do on a day-to-day basis. And then looking to the comfort and well-being side of this, there's many impacts of poor housing on health and well-being. Damp and mold being a chief one in the news in the UK over recent years. But there's a report that was commissioned by Friends of the Earth which looks at mental health as being an issue that's impacted both in adults and children in cold homes, amongst a lot of other particular health impacts. And there's a link at the bottom there if you wanted to look at that in more detail. So the problem and the opportunity exists on many fronts: carbon emissions, cost, comfort, well-being. And it's important really for us when we started to think about this toolkit to acknowledge that not everyone has the same priorities at the front of mind, and we'll come to that part in the actual process. But first, some basic principles which apply to all the Wayshaper toolkits, and these principles emerged out of a lot of research and development for the first one, working with groups of people who were setting up community-led housing projects. asking them about the process, asking people who'd already set up community-led housing projects and have been living in homes for many years about the process they'd been through. And so from that, we extracted lots of principles. And a huge one, and one which I found personally as well, I come at this as a point of view of like an ethnographic designer, I suppose. At the point I was in a nascent community-led housing group, and participation of the entire group and engagement of the entire group wasn't always easy for lots of different reasons. But one of the key principles of this is that that's achieved, and particularly within a cooperative co-op housing group, that obviously that's part of the values and principles of the group. And so it's looking for how members can engage and participate, and realizing that not everyone has the same opportunity for participation and engagement. So it's looking at how we can make that most accessible for people. The second one is exploration of all options. With both of these toolkits, there's a tendency for people to look towards the most obvious things. If we're thinking about sustainable homes and retrofit, in this country, at least in the UK, people often think about air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, which were getting a lot of exposure in the news through government funding. And of course, solar power has been with us for a long time. But really, they are top of the mind, and there's many other approaches and options which could be considered, which many people aren't aware of and might be more relevant to a particular home. For instance, a ground source heat pump isn't relevant to all homes. You need a lot of ground to put one in. So it's looking at different options that people might not be aware of, but also how those options interact. So there's a degree of holistic planning that comes into all of these toolkits, so that instead of making piecemeal choices, you're making a holistic plan that stretches over a number of years. And then accessible information. I mentioned that engagement and participation of members in a workshop is not always easy for lots of reasons, but one of them is penetrating the knowledge that you might need in order to participate. And so we've boiled the knowledge down into more simplified cards for workshops, which I'll go into in more detail, which allow everyone to participate and understand the issues, but then a more detailed level of information online, which is connected to those cards. So it's very much more hierarchical, stratified information to make it more accessible. So the toolkit itself, it has three kind of key objectives, as I meant, is to explore the resident needs and preferences. So really digging down into how do people live, or what's their experience of living in their homes, rather than assuming that because their home looks or feels in a certain way that that's their experience. Like, what's their day-to-day life experience? Reduce the cost in carbon emissions and increase the comfort and well-being. So in the toolkit, it comprises of a very neat box with a bunch of conversation workshop cards and a bunch of workshop options workshop cards, and then linked online resources. The process by which one would go through for using the toolkit is beginning with a conversations workshop, and I'll go into these stages in more detail, where we explore and understand residents' needs. The options workshop is ready to drilling down into which options might answer those residents' needs and preferences, and then engaging, in the case of CCH, engaging with the CCH retrofit team, but it could be engaging with any particular provider, which is going to then deliver the expert help in carrying out a retrofit if you're not carrying it out yourselves. So the initial conversations workshop is really aimed at opening it up to the entire membership of a co-op or a community-led housing group. And in many cases, that can be done around a table, that can be done in a conversational, convivial setting. And there'll be this five key topic areas which are prompted in those conversations. And it's really asking questions around some key experiences of living. And one of those is temperature. So we ask the residents the question, do they experience any of the following problems? And it's not just simply asking the question, are you hot, are you cold? It's why are you hot, why are you hot, why are you cold? What's it due to? Is it due to the fact that you can't afford to heat your home, or is it due to the fact that your home is drafty? And are the drafts coming from the floor or from the wall? So there's lots of different kind of ways of digging into the detail, which gives you a rough kind of assessment of the homes as well as people's experience of living in them. And something that's really important as well at this point is that we've got two ways of measuring how efficient or how inefficient a home is. One is the very objective measure, which is things like the energy performance certificate, which can tell you in very broad terms and somewhat dubious terms sometimes, the energy efficiency of a home and how well it's doing. And that will give you a broad kind of overview. But then there's equitable measure and planning. And from two identical homes, the inhabitants, the residents of those might have very different experiences of them. So for instance, lowered mobility, age or illness might make you, or would make you, susceptible to a higher sensitivity to overheating or being cold. And in the case of certain illnesses, it could actually gravely worsen it. So there's a need for taking into account the fact that everyone's experiences of living in their homes aren't the same. And we don't try to be too prescriptive about how these measures for planning and prioritizing retrofit work should be set out. It's more to propose that a group of people will need to understand what they're agreeing to, what measures and what planning priorities are they agreeing to in order to reach some decisions about how to retrofit. Beyond the workshop, I mentioned that, in many cases, a group might be able to sit around a table and do this together. But in many of the members of the CCH, they have hundreds of residents, and obviously not all in the same particular street or area. And so we've acknowledged this and broadened it out so that there is an opportunity to run online questionnaires which carry out the same function as the conversations workshop, and also printed questionnaires for people who don't have access or prefer not to use an online questionnaire. And that's really then aiming to draw in the same sentiment and understanding of people's experience, and to ensure broad engagement on participation. All this, as I mentioned, there's guidelines about how you organize yourselves as a group, but we're not prescriptive. And so different groups of people have slightly different ways of organizing themselves in terms of their decision making. But we suggest ways of approaching that. But there's obviously quite specific ways of working through the workshop and preparing for workshops. So following the conversations workshop and drawing together the sentiments and the feelings and the understanding of the fabric of the buildings that they live in, then boils down to a much tighter options workshop. And this would be run by a smaller core team of those who are responsible for running retrofit, representing, of course, the views and input received from the wider membership and the wider group of residents. These options fall across a number of different areas, and I'll come into a particular order in which we suggest these areas should be taken, but they cover the fabric of the house and also the ways that you might ventilate it, heat it, produce renewable energy. So it's covered the whole area in what's called a whole house retrofit or fabric first retrofit, which I'll come to. And that's just a quick overview of the cards. And you see on the left there one of the cards. And I'll just go into a bit of detail about what these cards contain. So this is the air source heat pump example. Across the top, we've got three metrics: carbon cost effectiveness, relative cost, and disruption. And they give a sense of, in the first instance, carbon cost effectiveness. How much bang am I getting for my buck? How much carbon am I looking to save by how much money am I spending? And so it gives a sense of the financial impact of that. If we looked at one of the other cards, which is essentially draft stripping your windows, you get maximum carbon cost effectiveness with very little disruption or cost. So there's quite quick ways of weighing up where your low-hanging fruit might be and where things might take a little bit longer to get your return on investment. Again, relative cost is important. We can't be too specific about this because it varies from place to place, but it gives you a broad idea, a broad way of weighing up comparative options that might be competing for attention. And similarly with disruption, some of the measures could be very, very disruptive, but they'll give you a longer term benefit. The next slot down is the traffic light system. And again, this is in service of really boiling down information to quite quick, simple pieces of information that you could work through rather quickly in a workshop and make fairly quick, intuitive decisions, and then verify those with the online resources. And so we've given anything which would be a definite problem which is going to come up, which you can't ignore. Other areas which things to consider, which you might need to take into consideration, and things where it just works really, really well. It works well, for instance, with underfloor heating and solar PV. And then grants available. They change all the time, but we do have some grants listed for the UK, at least, on the linked web pages. And then at the bottom of the card, there's a QR code, or alternatively a web address, and those are available for subscribers to the toolkit to be able to then link to much more in-depth pages, and that gives more information and content for making decisions. So I mentioned the fabric first whole house retrofit approach. Essentially, this works through a sequence of works always beginning with remedial work. There are a great many retrofit measures which you could take, which will greatly worsen your situation if you haven't corrected faults like leaks, for instance. So remedial work being taken place, but essentially not really considering, excuse me, not really considering renewable energy until you've stopped the leaking of energy using insulation or air tightness measures. There are some who I've spoken to who have an opposite view, where you can put solar in straight away. Again, this is an approach that CCH is standing by, but it's not the only approach, but it's the approach that this particular toolkit works across. You would of course always move into ventilation, and you wouldn't do this in sequence. Is if you're creating a more airtight home, you have unintended consequences of potentially making a much more damp home. So you look at these things in concert, and the cards would actually spell that out for you. So if you're looking at making a room airtight, then it indicates that you need to look at ventilation measures. And that's those implications and interdependencies, as I mentioned, they're quite quickly pointed out. So the air source heat pump here links to the hot water cylinder card and the radiators card. So it immediately gives you a set of options which need to be or ought to be considered together rather than piecemeal and then running into problems later on. So the outcomes are net. The point at which you then start immediately commissioning retrofit or doing retrofit. Unstable. Okay, I think I'm back with you now. I got a notice my internet was unstable. Apologies. The main outcome is that you've got resident buy-in and by engagement and consideration. I've been listening to a lot of people in local authorities talking about retrofitting social housing. And one of the main obstacles they've had is residents don't want people coming in and retrofitting their homes. But when they've understood the implications and the impacts and the benefits, they're more conversant with what it will benefit them, in what ways it will benefit them. So having that resident buy-in through engagement, but also, you know, canvassing their opinion, canvassing their needs, understanding the consequences, cost, implication, impact and disruption. So as I mentioned on that card, it gives you some very quick kind of a sense of how deep you're going to go into this and where you might need to think about related works that need to be undertaken. And then also conversance with options and technology. As an outsider, I've learned a huge amount about retrofit by doing this. So passive stack ventilation, for instance, I've read a lot about, which I didn't know anything about before this, but it really helps to up everyone's understanding of the particular options and the technological terms that are used behind them, so that you can then go into deeper work. But you can also speak reasonably knowledgeably with experts then, and really know which kind of expert support you might need. So you can be much more focused about which particular help and support you might need with a retrofit after having gone through this process. As Blase mentioned, we're looking at sustainability across the whole picture. We developed Wayshaper Group Planning and delivered that in 2020. We've delivered this in 2024. And next year, we'll be looking at sustainable organizations. So looking at governance and EDI, and also sustainable living. So the day-to-day living that a group of people want to agree to live by. And that might be everything from carpooling to food sourcing to how they use their energy. And this is aimed at then create a more holistic, sustainable way of living for groups of people. And we're also looking at the wider cooperatives sector as well, and how cooperative business can be supported by this kind of approach. So that is wayshaper.co.uk if you want to take a look. And yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Jim. I have a question about the intake. So what's the reception so far with community-led homes? Like, how many people are taking part in this program?
It's been distributed over the recent month or two. So this went out as part of the membership for CCH members, as part of their member package. Not everyone's really at the moment going to do a retrofit. So it's a case of as and when people are starting their retrofit. We know that there are some people who are already engaged in this process with CCH, and Blase can probably talk a bit more about those particular co-ops. But it's going to be a bit more of a trickle response, I fear, because of timings. During the research process for this, we spoke to a number of co-ops who had been going through this process for some time, but they didn't see that it was something they were going to solve this year. It's about understanding and drawing together funds and making those longer term plans and getting everyone on board. But we'll feed back to you later this year, hopefully. So yes, we'll be looking for that kind of feedback and response as it's used. It's really important for us to be able to continue and develop and fine tune this as it goes, as it's out in the real world. But Blase, yeah, you might have some more intel on that.
Well, I'm not going to start naming individual members of ours, but yeah, we've got more than 200 member co-ops, and quite frankly, if they all came at us in the same week saying we want to use this next week, that probably wouldn't be sustainable for us. So there will be early adopters. There will be organisations, as we know, that are already getting the pack out of the packaging when it turns up on the day and going, right, let's have a look at this. There's others that will pick this up as and when it's relevant to their organisation in their journey towards a zero carbon future. And I think what we aim to do with this and a whole suite of resources that we've created over nearly 20 years now is to provide our members with the range of tools and good practice that they need to govern their co-ops well. They'll pick these things up to an extent as and when it's right for them. But we see this as being something where there will be a number of early adopters. Once co-ops start seeing the benefits that those early adopters are enjoying from using these resources and upgrading their homes, more and more of them will look at this and say, oh, we fancy a bit of that ourselves. And then there'll always be the organisations that lag behind and probably need a little bit of a push from government policy and the like to consider retrofitting their homes and moving to a more sustainable footing. But as Jim says, we've only distributed these toolkits very recently, so it's going to be a bit of a lead-in period. But as Jim says, we'll collect data on that and we'll share that as we go forward.
Great, thank you. Hans, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting. You have goals as you showed them, and one goal, as we all know, is to provide reasonable housing. And on the other hand, you can have these demands on energy efficiency, etc. So, and you, Mr. Holt, you showed us when you're talking about this, you also have to address the cost. So I was wondering, because in Norway, we see that more demands from the government on energy efficiency. We are expecting soon a directive from EU, energy efficiency in buildings. And the big question everywhere is who is going to pay? Because yes, those goals can be very nice. And we see when we have votes in our housing associations, when they see the cost, they say, no, this cannot pass. So then we are looking for how can we get something from the government to push this, or but with this present situation with interest rates going up, etc. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit about how you deal with the cost and when you communicate this and how people react to it, actually.
I can't particularly go into that, but Blase probably has a bit more understanding around the decarbonisation fund that was being applied for.
I think the reality in the UK is that uh, our members need to see some level of investment from government through some form of grant program. And you know, when those grants are made available, suddenly the costs don't seem so scary because somebody else is offering to pay or part pay for them. I think also ultimately we're going to have to get better in bulk procuring private finance to sit alongside grants. So, you know, I'm thinking, how can we assist 200 co-ops in going to the capital markets rather than expecting each of them individually to do so and all paying a higher price for that finance because they're going individually. And I think also, inevitably, it's a bit like looking at the cost of a video player in 1981 or a video cassette in 1981 is eventually, the more that things become mainstream in terms of materials and technologies, the more the price normalizes. But that's probably quite a way away from where we stand today in terms of the cost of materials and technologies. So I think there's a combination of things here. Some organizations that we're dealing with are very committed to this agenda. They have a lot of latent asset value in their properties that they can borrow against. And to them, the cost indicator isn't the most important one. But I think it is also fair to say that in a number of our members, cost is the #1 priority. And so for them, they are more likely to be at a slightly later stage of the journey, shall we say, of engaging this. But I think there is more to be done by governments generally in terms of providing access to grants and other finance, and more that needs to be done in terms of working with the financial community to bring the money that not just our members need, but, you know, across the UK, all of our homes need this. It isn't just housing co-ops properties that need them, or local authorities properties. You know, we have as a society to find a financial solution to solving all of our homes problems, and there's more work that we're all going to have to do in getting those solutions over the line, because right at the moment, everybody going to lenders and capital markets on an individual basis, they're going to face higher costs of finance. And I think, you know, it's quite clear that also, and this is one of the things that you touched on, current interest rates. We've all seen a spike in interest rates since there's been a spike in inflation in the last 18 to 24 months. Whether that continues 2-3 years down the line will be dependent to an extent on various factors that are beyond our control, such as issues going on in parts of the world where there's significant conflict that's been impacting upon our inflation rates and our materials and other costs recently. So, you know, whether we still have those relatively high rates of finance remains to be seen. Where we were having these conversations with members 5 years ago, when they were looking at much lower interest rates, it was a different environment and a different conversation. But even then, I still think that the need for a more joined up approach to financing is appropriate.
Thanks, Blase. That's a great solution to do the bulk financing. You know, if a whole bunch of co-ops and other community-led homes are looking at doing some retrofit work, it's definitely a smart approach. Are there any other questions from other folks? I wanted to add that you know, I like the idea of the rating system that you have on the cards, on the carbon emissions, you know, for each solution. Like you used the example of the air source heat pump, you know, and the cost effectiveness and the level of disruption. You know, like there's so many decisions to be made in terms of all of the different solutions that you need to implement. You know, so to have that, you know, already, you know, hashed out, and you know, it makes the decision-making process a lot less cumbersome. So I think that's you know, really a really good idea to add that. That must have been, yeah, quite a lot of research to rate all of the different solutions.
Luckily, I didn't have to do it, but James and Maria put in quite a bit of time, so they were developing the content. But yeah, it's I think there's an element to which we want to enable, accelerate and simplify and create sort of fairly smooth workshops so that people can work through quite quickly, very rough and readily, by doing that comparison and sort of discounting certain things quite early on and including other things. And of course, there's other reasons why you discount, because, for instance, you're in a conservation area and you can't put double glazing in of certain types. So it's very quick at sort of helping you get through options, and then going into detail. I think the enemy of this would be spending months and months and months on it and not making any progress at all. Whereas with this type of approach, you can make progress fairly quickly and get a fairly good idea about whether you can actually approach this or not.
Mm-hmm. So it's similar to the governance toolkit, where you have like an army of people that are guiding the co-ops and the other groups through this process. Like you've trained, or well, I guess it's a new release. So is the plan to have like people that are experts in in sustainability to guide the groups through the process?
Yeah,
we have.
Sorry, go on, Blase.
So we have our own associates that specialise in the field, including James, but we also have partnered up with an organisation called UK Hempcrete that we're developing the ability to leverage those additional advisors and support. So we see this as building, that support element as part of the process. But unlike with the options, the early stage options planning for people setting up new organizations, where we trained up a lot of people to be able to go out in the field and help people do that early stage setup work, we've taken a different approach to this. We have some in-house associate resources, but we're also partnering up with other organizations more broadly. And I think, one of the key things that was an early founding principle around what we were trying to do with the Wayshaper suite of resources is, how can we help get people to the starting point quicker? How can we simplify things? How can we demystify things? How can we enable people to see the trade-offs, in a much more quick manner and in a simpler manner? And on one hand, that is about it being really clear in the toolkit about what things work with each other and what things don't work with each other, so people can eliminate unviable combinations of options in a quick and efficient manner. But also it's about with these three sliders, if you like, around disruption, relative cost, and carbon cost efficiency. It allows people to see the trade-off, the opportunity cost of, if I make this choice, how does it impact on the disruption element? So if I prioritize spending as little money as I can do, how does that impact on the savings that I'm making in carbon and the disruption? So the ability for people to see those trade-offs in a really clear sort of manner was really important to us. But you are right that James and Marie did a lot of work in ensuring that we got those indicators nailed down properly.
Yeah, no, that's great. Any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, I'm just gonna go through a few of our resources. So we have resources available on our website, and we also have videos on our YouTube channel. So the videos are mostly recordings of past webinars. We will include this one on our channel, and there's also video recordings of our podcast series called Co-op Conversations, which is a series on people living in housing cooperatives, to show the benefits of living in a housing cooperative. And we also speak to cooperative housing experts to share knowledge and good practices. Blase was in one, along with Tom Armstrong from the Co-op Housing Federation of British Columbia, talking about cooperatives on leasehold land. So that's one example. And on our website, we have a searchable resources section where we feature studies and reports. You'll see here on the screen that we have a study from the Social Market Foundation in the UK. It's a series of 5 reports that investigates the housing policy for solutions in the UK's housing shortage. So they explored housing policy in the Anglosphere. So that includes Australia, Ireland, Canada, and New Zealand. So you can find that on the resources section of our website. And we also have cooperative housing worldwide in our website, and so we have detailed information about many countries that have housing cooperatives. So we look at the history of the cooperative housing movement, how the co-ops are financed, the legal framework, and some basic statistics. And these are the most visited pages on our website. So we try to keep those updated as much as possible. And we are also on the major social media sites where we share co-op housing news, successes, developments, best practices. So we invite you to follow us on those various platforms. And that wraps it up for me. There's also Blase's contact details and mine as well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us.